All right, so we're diving into Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. This book uh, really flips the script on how we usually think about American history.
It does. Instead of that kind of polished official story, Zinn wants us to look at things from the perspective of, well, the people who were often left out, those whose voices weren't really heard.
Yeah, and he covers a lot of ground. I mean, we're talking
Yeah.
about everything from when Columbus arrived all the way to like the late 20th century.
Huge scope, and he's touching on, well, some really important but also sometimes difficult stuff. Early encounters with Native Americans, slavery, the Revolution, how big corporations gained power.
Lots to unpack, but I think if anyone's ready for this deep dive, it's our listeners.
I agree. This is about, I think, connecting the dots between all these events, figuring out how they all fit together, how they made the country what it is today, and, what it all means for us now.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. Columbus landing in the Americas. Zinn's take on this is, well, it's pretty jarring, especially when he brings in that first-hand account from Bartolomé de las
Oh,
Casas.
yeah. Las Casas, the priest who saw firsthand how the native people were being treated.
Exactly. And he doesn't hold back. He uses words like exasperating, ravaging, even mangling to describe what the Spaniards were doing.
Yeah. It's definitely not the, happy exploration story we often get in school. And Zen uses this to ask, why exactly do we celebrate Columbus Day when for many people it marks the start of being colonized and oppressed?
It's a good point. It makes you realize that history is often written from the point of view of the winners, you know. But what about all the people who suffered because of it? Zinn wants us to, like, really think about that.
Confront that, yeah. And that shift in perspective, that's at the core of his whole approach.
Okay, so moving on from Columbus, let's talk about how Zinn tackles slavery. His description of the transatlantic slave trade is honestly really tough to read. He talks about these ships where people were crammed in, like so tightly they could barely breathe, surrounded by disease and death.
It's horrific. And even if they survived that journey, there were often these forced marches after, thousands of miles in chains. It's estimated that 2 out of every 5 people died just on those marches.
The scale of suffering it's just unimaginable. But Zinn doesn't just dwell on the suffering, right? He also points out how resilient the enslaved people were and all the ways they resisted.
That's so important. He wants to show that even when faced with incredible cruelty, they fought back in so many ways, from small acts of defiance to, well, full-blown rebellions.
So even in those dark times, there's this thread of hope and resistance.
Absolutely. And that resistance, that's something we're going to see throughout Zinn's whole book. It connects different groups of people across different times. It's a powerful message about how resilient people can be and about, the never-ending fight for justice.
So now on to the American Revolution. I'm guessing Zinn has, well, a unique take on this too. It's not just about colonists bravely fighting for their freedom, is it?
Well, the ideals of liberty were definitely there. But Zinn argues that the revolution was also, in a lot of ways, a power struggle among the elites. A lot of ordinary people got left behind, especially, anyone who wasn't a white male landowner.
So it's a lot more complicated than just like the good guys versus the bad guys.
Way more complicated. He uses things like Bacon's Rebellion, which happened even before the Revolution, to show this. It was basically a revolt by indentured servants and poor farmers against the wealthy elite down in Virginia. Shows that those tensions, those inequalities, they were there from way back.
So these power dynamics, they were like baked into colonial society already.
Exactly. And Zinn's point is that those inequalities, they didn't just disappear after independence. He points out how, well, even though the Founding Fathers talked a big game about liberty, they were often more concerned about protecting their own interests. Makes you wonder whose freedom really mattered when the country was being formed.
That's a really interesting point. And it reminds me of something Zinn highlights.
Hmm.
A lot of the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, they actually held positions of power under British rule.
Kind of ironic, right?
It is. It definitely complicates the story.
For sure. And it kind of sets the stage for how Zinn looks at westward expansion, where you see those same themes, power and oppression, playing out all over again, especially with, Native Americans being driven from their land.
And that's something we'll definitely be digging into more in the next part of our deep dive.
The story of the Cherokee Nation is really a perfect example of how brutal and unfair westward expansion was.
Oh, absolutely.
They did everything they were supposed to, like tried to assimilate, really trying to appease the government. Right.
But in the end, they were still forced off their land.
It's just heartbreaking. There's this quote that Zinn includes from the historian Dale Van Every, and it really stuck with me.
Okay.
He said, for Native Americans, the land wasn't just like property.
Right.
It was holy ground, sanctified by the bones of their ancestors and the spirits with whom they held daily communion.
Wow.
And to have that taken from you, it's devastating.
It really shows how deeply connected they were to the land, a connection that I think a lot of settlers just didn't get.
Yeah.
Or just didn't respect. And that whole idea of manifest destiny, that belief that the U.S. was meant to, take over the whole continent.
Right.
That was used to justify all of it, the taking of the land, the violence.
It seems like notion building, so often it comes at such a high price, especially for people who are already marginalized.
Yeah, that's a theme we see over and over, isn't it?
Yeah.
The needs of the many are sacrificed so that a few can benefit.
Exactly. And that kind of leads us into the 19th century and the rise of those big industrialists like Rockefeller and Morgan.
And Zinn does not hold back when he's describing the tactics they used, to get so wealthy.
No, he doesn't.
He really paints a bleak picture of what it was like to be a worker during the Industrial Revolution.
He talks about dangerous workplaces, working crazy long hours, barely making any money.
Right.
And how, well, a lot of the workers were immigrants, new to the country.
Yeah.
They were seen as, disposable, just cogs in the machine of capitalism, basically.
And of course, people didn't just, accept those conditions.
No way.
We see labor unions starting to form and those big strikes like the Haymarket Affair and the Homestead Strike.
Right, where people fought back against that exploitation.
Exactly.
Though a lot of times those strikes were met with violence, the authorities often sided with the corporations.
Which shows just how unequal the power dynamic was.
Oh, yeah.
It's like that classic David and Goliath story. But here, it's everyday workers up against these massive companies with the government backing them up.
Yeah.
But it's also inspiring to see how people, despite the risks, organized and fought for better conditions.
It is. And for Zinn, focusing on these labor struggles is really important for his critique of capitalism.
Okay.
He argues that the system itself inherently leads to inequality and conflict.
So it's not just a few bad apples.
Yeah.
It's the system itself that's set up in a way that lets this exploitation happen.
Exactly. But it's not all bad news.
Okay.
Zinn also talks about, all these reform movements that started popping up around this time.
Yeah.
Even in the middle of all that struggle, there's still this hope and resistance.
One of the most powerful examples is the abolitionist movement, right?
Absolutely.
The fight to end slavery was such a long and hard fight. And Zinn brings in some of the key figures for the movement, like Frederick Douglass.
Douglass, yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant writer, incredible speaker.
He escaped slavery and dedicated his life to fighting for other people's freedom.
He was amazing. Zinn has some incredible quotes from him in there. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
Powerful.
Really makes you realize that change doesn't just happen.
Right.
People have to fight for it.
And the fight for equality, it didn't end with slavery.
Right.
The women's suffrage movement, that was another key struggle that Zinn explores.
Oh, absolutely.
He talks about figures like Sojourner Truth, who was, well, first she was enslaved, and then she became this powerful voice for both abolition and women's rights.
Her Ain't I a Woman speech is so powerful. And Zinn uses her story to show how all these movements are connected.
Right.
The fight for women's rights and the fight for racial justice, they're intertwined.
It makes you realize that all these different struggles are connected,
They are.
And it wasn't just about speeches and protests, though those were important.
Yeah.
Zinn emphasizes how these movements were powered by ordinary people, people who took risks and organized and demanded change.
Like all the women who organized those marches and wrote pamphlets and fought against all those unfair laws,
Right.
they're the ones who made the right to vote happen.
It was such a long and difficult battle,
It was.
but it's a powerful reminder of what it takes to make real change in society.
That courage and determination, yeah.
And focusing on these reform movements, it's like a little bit of hope in the midst of all these stories of oppression and struggle.
It is.
Shows that progress, it is possible, even if it's slow and happens little by little.
And Zinn's not naive about it.
Right.
He knows these movements faced a lot of opposition.
Go for it.
The people in power, they don't just give up control easily.
Yeah.
But he's also showing us that resistance, no matter what form it takes, can make a difference.
Right.
Can chip away at that power and eventually lead to real change.
That's a message that's still relevant today.
Definitely. And it kind of sets us up for when Zinn talks about the 20th century, where the U.S. becomes this major force in the world.
Right.
But as we're about to see, those same themes, the power, the oppression, the resistance, they're all still there, just playing out in new and complicated ways. So now we're getting into the 20th century. The U.S. is like this big global power.
Right, a major player. But Zinn's saying, well, that wasn't always a good thing.
Definitely not. He really questions that whole image of the U.S. as, the champion of freedom and democracy. He brings up all these examples of the U.S. getting involved in other countries' affairs, and it's usually about economics, not some noble goal.
Yeah, he really focuses on the Vietnam War. Like, that was a turning point, how brutal it was, how the government tried to hide what was really going on, and then that huge anti-war movement that came out of it.
Yeah, for a lot of Americans, it was like their eyes were suddenly opened, especially young people.
They couldn't ignore it anymore.
All those horrific images, those stories coming out of Vietnam, it made people question, what their government was doing, what it really meant for America to be so powerful.
And it wasn't just about ending the war either, right? The anti-war movement, it kind of sparks all these other movements for social justice too.
Absolutely. It was like all this energy, all this activism converging. The civil rights movement was already gaining momentum. Then the women's liberation movement starts emerging. And you've got growing concern about the environment, too.
Wow.
All these movements, they were all connected, fueled by this shared sense of like, things aren't right, things need to change.
It's pretty amazing to think about all those different groups coming together.
Yeah, all united by that desire for a more just world.
And that goes back to Zinn's point about the power of collective action, right?
Totally. When people come together, organize, they can challenge anything, even the most powerful systems.
And Zinn doesn't just focus on their big movements, does he? He also talks about smaller struggles that don't always get as much attention, like the fight for prisoners' rights.
Oh, yeah. He talks about how awful the conditions were in a lot of prisons. Overcrowded, violent, terrible medical care. And then that uprising at Attica in 71, that was a big moment for the prisoners' rights movement.
Even though it ended tragically.
Yeah, brutally put down. But it made the whole country pay attention to how prisoners were being treated.
It reminds us that the fight for justice, well, it happens everywhere, on so many different levels. It's about seeing everyone's humanity, no matter who they are or what they've done.
And that's at the heart of all those movements Zinn talks about. Whether it's about racial equality, gender equality, or economic justice, it's about expanding our idea of what a just society looks like, who deserves to be a part of it.
One thing that really struck me in Zinn's book is how much he emphasizes dissent. Like, he sees it as essential for a real democracy.
He's saying that the people in power, they're always going to try to shut down anyone who disagrees with them. They want to keep things the way they are, protect their own interests.
Makes sense.
It's the people who question, who challenge, who speak truth to power. They're the ones who make progress happen, who hold those in power accountable.
He's saying that throughout history, the people who made the biggest changes, they were the dissenters, the rebels, the ones who caused trouble.
Right. They're the ones who make us face those uncomfortable truths, who push us to build a better world.
And Zinn's book, it's an act of dissent itself, right?
Right.
He's challenging those accepted stories, those official versions of history, making us think critically about what we've been told.
Absolutely.
So where does all of this leave us? What are we supposed to take away from this? How does it apply to us today?
Well, for me, one of the biggest takeaways is that history isn't set in stone. It's not this like preordained story. It's made by people's choices and actions.
We can change things.
We have the power to shape the future. He's not just giving us a history lesson. It's a call to action.
Get involved.
Yeah, stand up for what you believe in, fight for a better world. He reminds us that the fight for justice, it never really ends.
Yeah. There's always going to be new challenges, new forms of oppression to resist. But he's also giving us hope.
Showing us that change is possible. That regular people, when they work together, they can do amazing things.
This deep dive, it's definitely given me a lot to think about. It's made me want to go back and look at everything I thought I knew about American history with fresh eyes.
I know what you mean.
And even more than that, it's like motivated me to get more involved in my community, find ways to make a difference. How about you? What are your final thoughts?
I think Zinn's work is this powerful reminder that we all have a part to play in making a better future. It's about staying informed, thinking critically, and most importantly, doing something.
Right.
Zinn said it best. You can't be neutral on a moving train. So we got to figure out where that train's going and make sure it's headed in the right direction.
That's a perfect way to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Hopefully you've got some new ideas to chew on and maybe even feel inspired to explore some of these moments in American history a little deeper.